The waiting room was packed with teenagers clutching sheet music, their faces a mix of nerves and excitement. Some were warming up their fingers on invisible keyboards. Others had their eyes closed, silently mouthing the notes they'd be playing in just minutes. The air smelled like old wood and furniture polish, the kind of smell you only find in buildings that have stood for over 100 years. 17-year-old David sat near the back, his mother beside him. His fingers tapped out a rhythm on his knees, a habit he'd picked up years ago whenever he felt anxious. His white cane leaned against the chair, its red tip barely visible under the seat in front of him. "You're going to be amazing," his mother whispered, squeezing his hand. "Just like you always are." David nodded, but his stomach was doing flips. This wasn't just any competition. This was the National Youth Music Competition, the kind of event that could change everything. Winners got scholarships, performance opportunities, and doors that normally stayed shut suddenly swung wide open. He'd been preparing for months, practicing until his fingers ached and his back hurt from sitting at the piano bench for hours. The sound of applause filtered through the heavy oak doors at the front of the room. Another contestant had just finished their audition. David counted in his head. He was number 43. There were still 7 people ahead of him. "David Chen?" a voice called out. "Wait, that was his name. He must have miscounted." "That's you, honey," his mother said, already standing and reaching for his arm. David grabbed his cane and stood up. The moment he did, he felt it. That shift in the air that happened whenever people noticed him. The conversations didn't stop exactly, but they got quieter. Different. He could practically hear the thoughts floating around the room. "Is that kid blind?" someone whispered, not quite soft enough. "How's he supposed to play piano if he can't see?" Another voice added. A few people laughed. Not mean laughs exactly, but the kind that comes from discomfort. The kind that says someone doesn't know what to think, so they fill the awkward silence with noise. David had heard it all before. The surprise. The doubt. The way people's voices changed when they realized he couldn't see them. Sometimes it was pity, which was worse than the mockery. At least mockery was honest. His mother's hand tightened on his elbow as they walked toward the stage entrance. "Don't listen to them," she murmured. "I'm not," David lied. The stage manager, a woman with a clipboard and tired voice, guided them through the doorway. David could tell the performance hall was huge just from the way sound moved through it. His footsteps echoed. The ceiling had to be high, maybe 30 feet or more. He could hear people shifting in their seats, probably the judges at their table down front. "Watch your step here," the stage manager said. 3 stairs up to the stage. David had done this dozens of times at different venues, but it never got less nerve-wracking. New spaces meant new layouts, new acoustics, new things to memorize. He counted the steps carefully. 1, 2, 3. His cane swept across the stage floor, mapping out the space. Then he heard it. The piano. Even without touching it, he could tell it was beautiful. A Steinway, probably a Model D concert grand. The sound of its presence filled the space in a way only a truly great instrument could. "Mr. Chen," a woman's voice called from the judges' table. It was formal but not unkind. "I'm Dr. Sullivan. Whenever you're ready, you may take your place at the piano." David made his way across the stage, his cane sweeping in careful arcs. He could feel eyes on him. Lots of eyes. The audience wasn't huge, maybe 100 people, but it felt like 1,000. He heard more whispers, more shifting in seats. Someone coughed, the sound echoing off the walls. When his cane touched the piano bench, relief washed through him. This was familiar territory. He folded the cane and set it carefully to the side, then sat down. His hands found the keys like greeting an old friend. Cool and smooth under his fingertips, each key exactly where it should be. "You'll be performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in C minor," Dr. Sullivan announced to the audience. Her voice had changed slightly. There was something in it now. Uncertainty, maybe concern. Someone in the audience gasped. Another person whispered, "That's one of the hardest pieces there is." David knew what they were thinking. How could a blind kid possibly handle Rachmaninoff? The piece was a monster, full of crashing chords and lightning-fast runs up and down the keyboard. Even experienced pianists found it challenging. The concerto demanded not just technical skill, but physical endurance and emotional depth. It was the kind of piece that separated the good from the great, but David hadn't chosen it to show off. He'd chosen it because he loved it. Because when he played it, he didn't feel blind or different or less than anyone else. He felt like himself, like the person he was meant to be. Can he actually play that? Someone asked, their voice carrying farther than they probably intended. This should be interesting, another person said with a laugh that wasn't quite friendly. David's hands tensed on the keys. His heart was pounding so hard he wondered if people could hear it. 6 months ago, he would have walked off this stage. He would have let the doubt win. But something had changed in him since then. He thought about his grandmother, the one who'd first put his hands on a piano when he was just 6 years old. She'd passed away 2 years ago, but he still heard her voice sometimes. Music doesn't need eyes, she used to tell him in Mandarin. Music needs heart, and yours is bigger than you know. He thought about Mrs. Holmes, his piano teacher, who never once treated him like he was fragile or limited, who pushed him harder than she pushed her other students because she knew he could handle it. He thought about that night 6 months ago when he'd almost given up, when he'd overheard his own school's music director suggesting he wasn't ready for the spotlight, when he'd told his mother he was done trying to prove himself to people who would never see past his blindness, and he thought about what his mother had done. She hadn't argued or tried to convince him. She just sat down at their old upright piano at home and played that same Taiwanese lullaby his grandmother had taught him all those years ago. The melody that had first shown him that sound could paint pictures more vivid than sight ever could. The question isn't whether the world will accept you, his mother had said quietly when the song ended. The question is whether you'll accept yourself. Whether you'll let your gift shine or keep it hidden because it's safer in the dark. Now, sitting at this Steinway in front of judges and critics and doubters, David took a deep breath. He lifted his hands above the keys, fingers curved and ready. The hall fell silent, waiting to see if the blind boy would fail. David smiled slightly. Let them wait. Let them doubt. In about 15 minutes, they'd understand something he'd known since he was 6 years old. You don't need to see music. You need to feel it. And he felt it in every cell of his body. His fingers came down on the keys, and the first notes of Rachmaninoff's masterpiece thundered through the concert hall. David hadn't always wanted to be a pianist. In fact, for the first 6 years of his life, he didn't think he wanted to be much of anything. Being born blind meant the world came to him in pieces. Sounds without faces, voices without bodies. Other kids talked about colors and clouds and the way sunlight looked on water, and David would nod along pretending he understood. But really, he felt like he was living in a different universe than everyone else. While neighborhood kids rode bikes and played catch in the street, David sat on his front porch listening. His parents tried their best. They bought him audiobooks and special toys designed for blind children. They signed him up for mobility training when he was 4. But nothing seemed to light him up inside. Nothing made him feel less alone. Everything changed the summer his grandmother came to visit from Taiwan. She was his father's mother, a tiny woman with a voice like wind chimes and hands that always smelled like the herbal ointment she rubbed on her joints. She'd been a music teacher back in Taipei for over 40 years before retiring. On her 3rd day visiting, she found David sitting in the living room by himself. His parents were at work, and the babysitter was in the kitchen making lunch. David was doing what he usually did, just sitting there, running his fingers over a textured ball, bored out of his mind. "Come here, little one," his grandmother said in Mandarin. His father had taught him to understand it, even if he couldn't speak it well. She took his hand and led him across the room. Then she placed both his hands on something cool and smooth. Keys. Piano keys. Their family had an old upright piano that his mother had played as a teenager. It had been sitting in the corner of the living room for years, mostly ignored except when his mother dusted it. His grandmother didn't say anything at first. She just pressed down on one of the keys under his finger. A single note rang out, clear and pure. Then another note. And another. She played a simple melody, a lullaby she'd probably sung to his father when he was small. "Now you," she said. David pressed a key. The sound filled the room, filled his head, filled something inside his chest he didn't know was empty. He pressed another key. Different note, different feeling. He pressed several at once, and the sounds crashed together in a way that made him laugh. Again, his grandmother said. She played the melody one more time. Then she guided his small fingers to the right keys, helping him recreate what she'd played. It took a dozen tries, then 100. But David didn't care. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about what he couldn't do. He was lost in what he could do. That afternoon stretched into evening. His parents came home to find David still at the piano, his grandmother beside him, both of them playing together. His mother started crying, though David didn't understand why at the time. "He's found it," his grandmother said in English so everyone could understand. "His window." She stayed with them for 2 more months that summer, and every single day she taught David something new. Not how to read music, that would come later in a different form, but how to listen. Really listen. How to hear the space between notes. How to feel the rhythm in his chest like a heartbeat. How to let his fingers dance across keys like they were telling a story only he could hear. By the time his grandmother flew back to Taiwan, David could play a dozen songs by ear. Simple ones, mostly children's songs and folk melodies. But he'd found something that made him feel connected to the world in a way nothing else ever had. His parents knew they had to do something. They couldn't afford fancy music schools, and honestly, they weren't sure where to even start looking for a teacher who could work with a blind student. But his mother asked around at the community center, and someone mentioned Mrs. Holmes. Patricia Holmes was 72 years old and had been teaching piano for longer than David's parents had been alive. She'd retired from taking new students 5 years earlier. But when David's mother called and explained the situation, something in her voice made Mrs. Holmes say yes. Their first lesson was awkward. Mrs. Holmes admitted right away that she'd never taught a blind student before. She wasn't sure how to do it. All her methods relied on reading sheet music, on watching hand positions, on visual demonstrations. "Well," she said after a long pause, "I suppose we'll figure it out together." And they did, slowly at first. Mrs. Holmes would play a phrase and David would replay it. She'd place his hands in the correct position and let him feel where his fingers needed to go. She recorded lessons on cassette tapes so he could practice at home, listening over and over until every note was burned into his memory. What Mrs. Holmes discovered, and what amazed her for years afterward, was that David's brain worked differently than her sighted students. Where they saw patterns on a page, David heard architecture in 3 dimensions. He could memorize a 5-minute piece after listening to it 20 times. His sense of pitch was so precise he could tell when the piano was even slightly out of tune. But it wasn't easy. Not even close. Other students could glance at sheet music and see what was coming next. David had to have every single note memorized before he sat down to play. When Mrs. Holmes assigned a new piece, it took David 3 times longer than her other students to learn it. Other students could practice anywhere there was a piano. David needed to memorize the space first. How many steps from the door to the bench? Where the pedals were positioned? How the room's acoustics changed the sound? And then there were the comments. Always the comments. At his first recital when he was 8, he heard parents whispering, "Is that the blind boy? How does he know what to play?" Poor thing. That word, poor, like he was something broken that needed pity. When he was 11, he entered his first competition. He came in 2nd place, and afterward he overheard one of the judges talking. "He's good, obviously, but we should consider if he needs special accommodation. We don't want to give him an unfair advantage. An unfair advantage. Like the hundreds of extra hours he practiced somehow didn't count. Like memorizing entire concertos note by note was easier than reading them off a page." By the time David reached high school, he'd won regional competitions and performed at community events. Local newspapers wrote articles about him, always with the same angle: the blind piano prodigy, the boy who overcame his disability. Like his blindness was the most interesting thing about him, not his music. His teacher, Mrs. Holmes, saw it differently. "You're not a blind pianist," she told him once. "You're a pianist who happens to be blind. There's a difference." But the world didn't see that difference, and slowly the constant doubt started to wear him down. It all came crashing down during his junior year. His high school was hosting its annual winter concert, a huge deal with hundreds of people attending. The orchestra director asked David to perform, the first junior ever given that honor. David was excited, proud. This felt like real recognition from people who knew him, not just some novelty act for strangers. Then came the rehearsal 3 weeks before the concert. David arrived early, as always. He was backstage warming up on an old practice piano when he heard voices from the main hall. The director was talking to the principal. Their voices carried through the empty auditorium. "I'm worried about logistics," the director said. "What if he can't follow my conducting? What if he loses his place during the performance? Are you saying he can't do it? The principal asked. I'm saying maybe we should give him something simpler. A solo piece instead of the concerto. Something where he's not dependent on visual cues from me. David's hands froze on the keys. These were people who'd heard him play dozens of times. People who knew exactly what he could do. And they still doubted him. He finished the rehearsal on autopilot, didn't say a word about what he'd heard. But that night, sitting at the dinner table with his parents, he finally spoke. I'm done, he said quietly. Done with what? His father asked. Performing, competitions, all of it. What's the point? No matter how good I get, people will always see me as the blind kid trying his best, not as a real musician. His mother didn't argue. She didn't give him a pep talk or tell him he was wrong. She just finished dinner, cleared the dishes, and sat down at their old upright piano. Then she played. That same Taiwanese lullaby his grandmother had taught him 11 years earlier. When the last note faded, his mother turned to him. Your grandmother used to say something. She said music doesn't choose people. People don't choose music. Music and people choose each other. And once that choice is made, it's forever. She paused, and David could hear her voice getting thick with emotion. She believed music chose you, David. Not because you're blind, but because of who you are. The question isn't whether other people believe in you. The question is whether you'll believe in yourself. That conversation happened 6 months ago. 6 months before David walked onto the National Youth Music Competition stage. 6 months before he sat at that Steinway grand piano with 100 people waiting to see him fail. But something had shifted that night. Something his mother's words had unlocked. He wasn't going to hide his gift because the world was too small-minded to see it. He was going to play, and he was going to make them listen. The whispers in the concert hall were getting louder. David could hear them clearly now, sitting at the Steinway with his hands hovering above the keys. How much do you want to bet he messes up in the first minute? Someone said from the audience. My cousin studied Rachmaninoff for 2 years and still can't get it right. Another voice added. No way this kid can do it. A few people laughed. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind that comes when people think they're about to witness a disaster. The kind of laugh that says they're already preparing their sympathetic faces for when it all goes wrong. David's heart was hammering in his chest. His palms felt sweaty against the smooth keys. For a split second, he wondered if they were right. Maybe he was crazy to attempt this piece at a national competition. Maybe he should have chosen something safer. Something that wouldn't give people ammunition when they talked about him later. Then he remembered why he was here. Not to prove anything to these people. Not to win their approval or change their minds. He was here because music was his language and he had something to say. Something that couldn't be said with words. He took a deep breath and let his fingers drop to the keys. The opening chord crashed through the concert hall like thunder. The effect was immediate. The whispers stopped. Even the people who'd been betting against him went silent. Because whatever they'd been expecting, it wasn't this. David's hands moved across the keyboard with absolute certainty. The dark, brooding melody of Rachmaninoff's concerto filled every corner of the massive hall. His left hand laid down the powerful bass notes while his right hand danced through the melodic lines, each note placed with surgical precision. But it was more than just hitting the right keys. Anyone who practiced enough could eventually memorize the notes. What David was doing was different. He was breathing life into the music. Every phrase had weight and meaning. Every crescendo built to something bigger. Every soft passage whispered secrets only he seemed to know. Dr. Sullivan, the head judge, found herself leaning forward in her chair. She'd heard this concerto performed hundreds of times by students and professionals alike. She knew every note, every phrase, every place where young pianists typically struggled, but she'd never heard it quite like this. In the wings of the stage, the other competitors stood frozen. The group that had been making jokes about David just minutes ago was completely silent now. One girl, a pianist from Boston who'd won 3 state championships, had tears running down her face. She couldn't explain why. The music just hit something deep inside her chest. David wasn't thinking about any of them. When he played, the rest of the world disappeared. It was just him and the piano and the music that lived in the space between. His grandmother had tried to explain it to him once. Sighted people see music on paper, she'd said. Black dots on white pages. But you see it differently. You see it the way it actually exists, as sound and feeling and movement through space. She was right. When David played, he could see the music in his mind. Not with his eyes, obviously. but he could sense its shape, its architecture. He knew exactly where his hands needed to travel, how much force each note required, where to lean into the emotion and where to pull back. The concerto's first movement was technically brutal. Rapid runs up and down the keyboard that required both hands to move in perfect synchronization, massive chords that demanded strength and control, delicate passages that needed a feather-light touch. Most 17-year-olds would be sweating and struggling to keep up with the physical demands. David made it look effortless. His face was calm, almost peaceful. His body swayed slightly with the music, feeling the rhythm in his bones. His fingers never hesitated, never stumbled, never second-guessed. They knew exactly where to go because he'd spent 6 months preparing for this moment, 6 months of practice that went far beyond just memorizing notes. He'd listened to 12 different recordings of this concerto, each one performed by a master pianist. He'd studied how each artist interpreted the tempo, the dynamics, the emotional arc. Then he'd found his own voice within the piece, his own way of telling the story that Rachmaninoff had written over a century ago. Because that's what great music was, David believed. It was storytelling, and this concerto told a story of struggle and triumph, of darkness and light, of a soul searching for something it couldn't quite name. The second movement began, and the mood shifted entirely. Where the first movement was powerful and dramatic, the second was intimate and heartbreaking. A simple, beautiful melody that sounded almost like a lullaby. This was the part David loved most. The part that reminded him of his grandmother, of those first afternoons at the old upright piano, of discovering that music could be his window to the world. His touch on the keys became impossibly gentle. Each note floated into the air like a whispered secret. The melody was so pure, so vulnerable, that people in the audience found themselves holding their breath, afraid to make any sound that might disturb it. Mrs. Holmes, David's teacher, was sitting in the back row. She was crying now, not even trying to hide it. She'd taught hundreds of students over her 50 years as a piano teacher. Good students, talented students, students who'd gone on to prestigious conservatories and successful careers. But David was different. She'd known it from that very first lesson when he was 6 years old. There was something special about the way he connected with music. Not just technically, though his technical skill was remarkable, but emotionally, spiritually even. He didn't just play the notes. He lived inside them. The second movement built to a climax that was all the more powerful because of its restraint. David's hands moved across the keyboard with a tenderness that made the piano sound like it was singing, like it was a human voice expressing something words could never capture. Then came the third movement, and the energy exploded back to life. This was the showstopper, the part where Rachmaninoff pulled out all the stops, lightning-fast runs that zigzagged across the entire keyboard, thundering chords that shook the floor. Rhythms that pushed and pulled and drove forward with unstoppable momentum. David attacked it with fierce joy. His hands became a blur of motion. Left hand, right hand, both hands together, leaping across octaves, crushing out massive chords, then immediately pivoting to delicate trills and runs. The technical difficulty was off the charts, the kind of playing that takes years to master. And he was 17. In the audience, several professional musicians who'd come to judge or observe were shaking their heads in disbelief. This wasn't just good playing. This was exceptional. World-class, the kind of performance you saw maybe once or twice a year if you were lucky. And it was coming from a blind teenager who supposedly had no business attempting this piece. Dr. Sullivan was scribbling notes on her judging sheet, but her hand was shaking. She kept stopping to just listen, forgetting she was supposed to be evaluating. She'd been a judge for 3 decades. She'd seen child prodigies and gifted students and talented young musicians. She'd watched performers who would go on to play Carnegie Hall and the Royal Albert Hall. But this was something else. The other judges at the table were having similar reactions. One of them, a stern man who'd been teaching at a conservatory for 40 years and rarely showed emotion, had actual goosebumps on his arms. The competitors backstage were experiencing something complicated. Part of them knew they'd just witnessed something extraordinary, something that deserved celebration. But another part of them felt the competitive sting of knowing they couldn't match it. The girl from Boston had stopped crying and was now just staring at the stage with a look of awe mixed with defeat. "How is he doing this?" someone whispered. "I don't know," another competitor answered quietly. But I think we're watching something we'll tell people about for the rest of our lives. David was nearing the end now. The final section of the concerto where everything came together. All the themes from earlier movements returned, transformed and elevated. The music built and built, climbing toward the inevitable conclusion. His hands were starting to ache. His back was sore from the physical exertion. Sweat was trickling down his temples. But he didn't care. He was lost in the music in this moment, in the pure joy of doing the thing he loved most in the world. The final chord was coming. The big finish that Rachmaninoff was famous for. A massive, triumphant crash of notes that needed to ring out like a declaration of victory. David's hands rose above the keyboard one last time. His whole body gathered itself for the final strike. Every person in that concert hall was leaning forward waiting for it. And then his hands came down. The final chord exploded through the concert hall with such force that people felt it in their chests. Every string in the piano vibrated, creating a wall of sound that seemed to fill not just the room but the entire building. The note hung in the air, resonating, fading slowly like the last rays of sunset disappearing below the horizon. David's hands stayed on the keys, his head bowed slightly, his chest rising and falling as he caught his breath. Sweat dampened his shirt. His fingers ached. His shoulders burned from the physical effort. But inside he felt light, complete. Like he'd just said everything he needed to say without speaking a single word. Then came the silence. 3 seconds. 4. 5. It was the kind of silence that felt heavy, loaded with something about to break. David's heart started to race again. Had he made a mistake? Had he missed something? Why wasn't anyone reacting? Then it happened. The sound started small, just one person clapping. Then 2, then 5. Then the entire hall erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't the kind of clapping you give because you're supposed to. This was different. People were on their feet, shouting, cheering like they'd just witnessed something they'd never forget. The sound was deafening, bouncing off the high ceilings and wooden walls. David's mother was crying in the audience, her hands clasped over her mouth. Mrs. Holmes was standing with tears streaming down her face, clapping so hard her hands hurt. Even the stage manager who'd guided David onto the stage was applauding, something she almost never did. The other competitors backstage weren't sure what to do. Some of them were clapping genuinely, overwhelmed by what they'd just heard. Others clapped more slowly, their faces complicated mixtures of admiration and disappointment. The girl from Boston who'd won 3 state championships was clapping hard, tears still on her cheeks, but she was also smiling. A real smile. That was incredible, she said to no one in particular. I've never heard anything like that. The boy standing next to her, who'd made jokes about David failing just an hour ago, couldn't look anyone in the eye. He clapped quietly, his face burning with shame. Dr. Sullivan stood up from the judges' table and walked toward the stage. The applause continued, showing no signs of stopping. She had to raise her voice to be heard over the noise. "Ladies and gentlemen, please," she said, but she was smiling wider than anyone could remember seeing her smile. "Please, let's allow our performer to take a bow." David stood from the piano bench, his legs a little shaky. He wasn't entirely sure which direction to face. He could hear the applause coming from everywhere, wrapping around him like a wave. His mother had taught him to bow toward where he heard the loudest response. So he turned slightly and bowed from the waist. The applause got even louder. "Mr. Chen," Dr. Sullivan said, now standing at the edge of the stage. Her voice was thick with emotion. "In 30 years of judging these competitions, I have never, and I mean never, heard Rachmaninoff performed with such profound understanding and technical mastery." She paused, and the hall fell silent again so people could hear her. What we just witnessed was not simply a performance. It was a revelation. You didn't just play that concerto. You revealed layers of it that I've never heard before, despite hearing this piece performed hundreds of times by professionals and students alike. David felt his throat tighten. He hadn't expected this. Polite praise, maybe. A decent score, but this? "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice barely audible. The applause started again, but Dr. Sullivan raised her hand to quiet the crowd. "I'm not supposed to announce results until all contestants have performed," she said. "But I feel I must say this now, while we're all still feeling the impact of what we just experienced." She looked at the other judges, who nodded at her. "Mr. Chen, You have set a standard today that will be very difficult for any other performer to match. What you've done here is remarkable not just as a technical achievement, but as an artistic statement. You've reminded all of us why we fell in love with music in the first place." David stood there, not entirely sure what to say or do. He could hear people in the audience crying. He could hear whispered conversations. He could feel the energy in the room, electric and alive. "How does it feel?" Dr. Sullivan asked him gently. David thought about the question. How did it feel? 6 months ago, he'd wanted to quit. 6 months ago, he'd been ready to give up on music entirely because he was tired of fighting for recognition, tired of proving himself to people who only saw his blindness. "It feels like I did what I was supposed to do," David said finally. "Not for anyone else. Just for the music." Dr. Sullivan nodded slowly. "That's the mark of a true artist," she said quietly, just loud enough for the microphone to catch it. "Playing for the music itself, not for applause or approval. Though you certainly have both now." As David walked off stage, guided by the stage manager, the applause continued. It didn't stop until he was completely out of sight. Even then, people stood around talking excitedly, replaying what they'd just heard in their minds. Backstage, something strange happened. The competitors who still had to perform looked panicked. One girl, scheduled to play after lunch, was frantically talking to her teacher about switching to a different piece. "I can't follow that," she kept saying. "There's no way. Everyone will just be comparing me to him." The boy who'd made jokes about David earlier approached him hesitantly. David was sitting in a corner drinking water and trying to process what had just happened. "Hey," the boy said awkwardly. "I just wanted to say that was amazing, really. I've never heard anyone play like that." David recognized the voice. This was one of the people who'd laughed at him in the waiting room. "Thanks," David said simply. "And I wanted to apologize," the boy continued, his voice getting quieter, "for what I said earlier about you failing. That was stupid and mean, and I'm sorry." David was quiet for a moment. Part of him wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the hurt, but what would that change? The boy was apologizing. "That was more than most people did." "It's okay," David said. "People doubt what they don't understand. I'm used to it." "You shouldn't have to be," the boy said. "Used to it, I mean. What you just did in there, that wasn't about being blind or sighted or anything like that. That was just pure talent, pure dedication. I practice 4 hours a day and I couldn't play like that if I had 100 years. David smiled a little. "You probably practiced the wrong things then. It's not about hours. It's about connection." His mother found him a few minutes later. She didn't say anything at first, just wrapped him in a hug that lasted a long time. When she finally pulled back, her voice was shaky. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said. "I wish she could have been here to see this." "Maybe she was," David said softly. "In a way." Mrs. Holmes arrived next, still dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "David Chen, you just proved something I've believed for 11 years. You're not just a good pianist. You're an exceptional one. And today, you made everyone in that hall see it too." The rest of the competition felt almost anti-colonial. Other students performed well, some of them very well. But everyone knew. The judges knew. The competitors knew. The audience knew. Something special had happened during David's performance. Something that couldn't be replicated or topped. By the time the final competitor finished that evening, people were exhausted. The judges retreated to deliberate, but everyone suspected the conversation would be short. David sat with his mother in the now nearly empty hall, waiting for results. Other families waited too, but there was a strange energy in the room. Usually these waiting periods were tense with competition and hope. Tonight felt different. People kept glancing at David, some smiling, some looking almost sad, like they already knew how it would end. "Nervous?" his mother asked. "Not really," David said honestly. "Even if I don't win, I did what I came here to do. I played my best. I told the story I wanted to tell. That's enough." But his mother heard something in his voice, a confidence that hadn't been there 6 months ago. Back then he'd been angry and defeated, ready to give up. Now he sounded sure of himself, grounded, like he'd finally figured out who he was and what he was meant to do. "You've changed," she said softly. "These past months, you're different," David nodded. "I stopped trying to prove I'm as good as everyone else," he said. "I started trying to be the best version of myself. Turns out that's harder, but it's better." 20 minutes later, Dr. Sullivan emerged from the judge's room. She was carrying an envelope and wearing an expression that was hard to read. Professional, serious, but her eyes were bright. "We have our results," she announced to the families gathered in the hall. "But before I share them, I want to say something." She paused, looking around at the young musicians and their parents. "Every year, we see talented young people walk through these doors. Students who've practiced countless hours, who've dedicated themselves to their craft, who've sacrificed time and energy to be here. All of you should be proud of what you've accomplished just by making it to this stage." She opened the envelope slowly. "However, once in a great while, we witness a performance that transcends competition, a performance that reminds us why music matters, why art matters, why we do what we do." David's heart started pounding again. He heard his mother take a sharp breath beside him. David thought the competition would be the end of the story. Win or lose, he'd play his piece, prove something to himself, and life would go back to normal. Piano lessons with Mrs. Holmes, school, practice. The quiet routine he'd built over the years. He was wrong. 3 days after the competition, his mother got a phone call. Then another. Then 5 more. By the end of the week, their answering machine was full of messages from people David had never heard of. Music conservatories, performance venues, news reporters, a literary agent who wanted to write a book about his journey. "This is crazy," David said, listening to his mother describe the latest call. "It was just one performance." "It wasn't just anything," his mother replied gently. "Someone recorded it on their phone and posted it online. David, the video has been viewed over 2 million times." David sat down heavily on the couch. 2 million? That was more people than lived in his entire city. More people than he could even imagine in one place. "What are they saying?" he asked, almost afraid to know the answer. His mother pulled up the video on her laptop. She'd learned to read comments to him over the years, filtering out the mean ones, focusing on the genuine responses. But this time she didn't need to filter much. One person wrote, "I've been playing piano for 15 years and I'll never sound like this. This kid is the real deal." She scrolled down. Someone else said, "I'm not even into classical music, but I listened to this whole thing without skipping. Absolutely beautiful." She kept reading. Comments from professional musicians praising his technique. Comments from other blind people saying he'd inspired them. Comments from parents saying they'd played the video for their kids to show them what dedication and passion could achieve. But one comment made David's mother pause. Her voice got quiet as she read it. This one says, "I'm a music teacher, and I'll be honest, when I saw he was blind, I assumed this would be a pity performance. Something we'd clap for to be nice. I was completely wrong. This kid didn't just play well despite being blind. He played like someone who sees music in a way the rest of us never will. He changed how I think about disability and ability. Thank you for sharing this." David felt something catch in his throat. That was exactly what he'd wanted. Not pity, not special treatment. Just recognition that his blindness didn't define his music. That he was a pianist who happened to be blind, not a blind person who happened to play piano. The opportunities kept coming. Jeered called, offering a full scholarship. So did 3 other prestigious conservatories. A concert hall in Philadelphia invited him to perform. Then one in Chicago. Then one in New York. Mrs. Holmes came to their house to talk about it all. She was 74 now, moving a little slower than when David first started lessons, but her mind was still sharp. "This is your decision, David," she said, "but I'll tell you what I think. You have a gift, a real one. Not just talent, though you have plenty of that, but a way of connecting with music that's rare, maybe once in a generation rare." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "You can stay here, keep taking lessons with me, play locally, have a good life, a comfortable life. And there's nothing wrong with that. Or you can step into the bigger world, take the scholarship, study with masters, perform on stages where thousands of people will hear you. It'll be harder, scarier, more demanding. But David, I think that's the path you're meant for." David was quiet for a long moment. "What if I fail?" he asked. "What if I get to Juilliard and everyone there is better than me? What if I can't handle the pressure?" Mrs. Holmes laughed, a warm sound full of affection. "David Chen, I've been teaching piano for 52 years. I've seen hundreds of students come through my studio. Some were talented. Some worked hard. A few were both, but you're the only one who made me cry during a performance. The only one who made me feel like I was hearing a piece for the first time, even though I've known it for decades." She reached over and patted his hand. "You won't fail. You might struggle. You might have hard days, but fail? No, that's not possible for someone who loves music the way you do. David chose Juilliard. The decision felt right even though it terrified him. Leaving home, moving to New York City, studying alongside the best young musicians in the world. Everything would be different. His last lesson with Mrs. Holmes was emotional for both of them. She taught him for 11 years, watched him grow from a quiet 6-year-old into a confident young man. She'd been there for every breakthrough and every setback. You changed my life, David told her. You never treated me like I was fragile or limited. You just taught me music, Mrs. Holmes smiled, her eyes wet. You changed mine too. You reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place. Not to create perfect performances, but to help people find their voice. And David, you found yours. Now go share it with the world. Juilliard was everything David hoped for and everything he feared. The other students were incredibly talented. The expectations were sky high. The practice rooms were occupied at all hours by musicians pushing themselves to their limits. But David fit in. Not because he was blind, though his story was known by everyone on campus, but because he belonged there. He was as good as anyone in his class, better than some, and the professors recognized it. His teacher, a renowned pianist who'd performed with orchestras around the world, pulled him aside after their first lesson. I've taught many gifted students, the professor said, but you have something special. You don't just play notes, you understand the architecture of music, the way phrases build and resolve, the emotional journey of a piece. That can't be taught. It's intuitive, and you have it. David performed regularly throughout his time at Juilliard. Concert halls, university events, charity fundraisers. Each performance drew crowds, partly because of his growing reputation, partly because people were curious about the blind pianist they'd heard about. But something interesting started happening. People stopped talking about his blindness first. The introductions changed. Instead of "This is David Chen, the blind pianist," it became, "This is David Chen, one of the most talented young pianists in the country, who also happens to be blind." It was a small change in words, but it meant everything. 3 years into his studies, David was invited to perform at Carnegie Hall as part of a showcase for young musicians. Carnegie Hall, the venue where legends had played for over a century, where Rachmaninoff himself had performed. The night of the concert, David felt surprisingly calm. He'd played on dozens of stages by now. He'd performed for crowds of thousands. But this was different. This was a statement, not just about his ability, but about what was possible. Backstage, before he went on, his mother called. "Your grandmother would be so proud," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "She always knew you were special. She saw it that very first day when she put your hands on the piano keys." "I wish she could be here," David said. "She is," his mother replied. "Every time you play, she's there. In the music. In your heart. In everything you've become." David walked onto the Carnegie Hall stage to thunderous applause. The audience was packed, every seat filled. He could feel the energy of the room, the anticipation, the excitement. He sat at the piano and took a moment to appreciate where he was. All the doubt he'd faced. All the people who said he couldn't do this. All the times he'd wanted to quit. They'd all led to this moment. Then he began to play. What came out wasn't just music. It was a conversation, a story, a declaration that talent and dedication matter more than any limitation society tries to place on you. That blindness isn't a barrier to greatness. That anyone, absolutely anyone, can achieve extraordinary things if they're willing to work for it and believe in themselves. The performance was transcendent. When the final note faded, the silence lasted even longer than it had at the competition. Then the audience erupted in a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. People were crying, cheering, throwing flowers onto the stage. David stood and bowed, a smile spreading across his face. Not because of the applause, though that was wonderful, but because he'd done it. He'd taken the gift his grandmother had shown him and turned it into something bigger than himself. Something that touched people, changed people, inspired people. After the concert, reporters asked him about his success, about overcoming his disability, about his plans for the future. "I don't think about overcoming anything," David said. "Being blind is just part of who I am, like having brown hair or being right-handed. It's not something to overcome. It's just my reality, and in that reality I found music. Music doesn't care if you can see. It only cares if you can feel, and I feel everything." He paused, thinking about how to explain what he meant. People see me as a blind pianist who succeeded despite his limitation, but that's not how I see myself. I'm just a pianist, someone who loves music and wants to share it. The blindness isn't the story. The music is the story, and it's a story I'll keep telling for as long as I can. David went on to have a remarkable career. He performed in concert halls around the world. He recorded albums that won awards. He taught master classes where he passed on everything Mrs. Holmes had taught him, helping young musicians find their own voices. But perhaps his greatest achievement was changing how people thought about disability and potential. He